So please welcome to the stage Mr. Douglas Trumbull.
Thank you very much. This is going to be a rather unusual show today because I've tried to take everything I've done since I was a kid and put it all into 2 hours. And that's compressed, believe me, so not everything is here. But I'll get into it right away, and I'm going to take it pretty much chronologically, so I think it'll make a certain amount of sense. When I was... Oh, I think the shutter on the projector is not open because should have other way. When I was just out of high school, I started. I was going to be an architect, I thought, and I started taking courses in illustration and painting and mechanical drawing and engineering drawing and things like that. I became very fascinated with kind of science fiction illustration, and this was one of the paintings that's actually in the lobby of my office that I made. It's one of the few I kept. Science fiction, spacecraft, alien planet. My portfolio was full of that kind of stuff. And so that got me a job working at this company called Graphic Films in Hollywood that did space films for NASA and the Air Force. And they ended up doing a film, we ended up doing a film for the New York World's Fair in 1964 called To the Moon and Beyond. And it was all multiplane photography, fisheye lenses projected into a dome theater. This was the dome theater here on the left. It was called the Travel and Transportation Pavilion. It was a weird film format called Cinerama 360, which was 10 perforation, 70 millimeter film. The image was circular and photographed with fisheye lenses and wide-angle lenses, projected with fisheye lenses into a kind of a planetarium dome theater. And the show was called To the Moon and Beyond. And Stanley Kubrick and Arthur Clarke saw this show, which I had done all the illustrations for, which were part of the multiplane photography. And Graphic Films got a job to start doing some preliminary early design work for 2001: A Space Odyssey, which at the time was called Journey Beyond the Stars in a very early draft. And this is one of my early pencil sketches for a kind of a lunar base. You can see some similarity here to the horizon on the moon, the Earth in the distance, various kinds of lunar modules and stuff like that. An idea for a pod, which became like a pod in 2001. But I wanted to digress a little bit about Cinerama, and I'm going to show you a 10-minute film, which is a little bit long because all my other clips are much shorter. And I showed this last night as part of the 2001 thing. I don't know if anybody here has ever seen a 3-strip original Cinerama projection of a movie. Two or three people. Well, it's a very rare thing. It's a process that was developed in the 50s, but it's really part of my whole life, which I saw this as a kid. I saw these Cinerama movies as a kid, and I was always kind of heard these weird stories about Cinerama, 3 cameras in a triptych, 3 projectors on a giant curved screen. The Cinerama screens were 90 feet wide, which was enormous, 6 times the size of the screen in width and height. And I found out that before Cinerama, there was this thing called the Versatile Gunnery Trainer, or Vitarama, which was 5 cameras and 5 projectors in a dome screen to train gunners to shoot at airplanes. So they shot these weird 5-camera, 5-projector movies of aircraft attacking, and then they used photoelectric cells and fake guns. And this explains the whole thing, but it goes on. This is a distillation of a documentary that is part of the Blu-ray box set of How the West Was Won. So they restored How the West Was Won, which is one of the best 3-camera movies. And as part of it, this friend of mine made a documentary called the Cinerama Experience, which chronicles the history of Cinerama, which talks a lot about widescreen movies, very deeply curved screens, cumbersome giant cameras, the difficulties of even the best directors in the world, and one of the directors on How the West Was Won was John Ford, and he's one of the greatest directors of all time, had big trouble dealing with this because the field of view was so wide that every shot was like a master shot. It was very hard to do a close-up, very impossible to do an over-the-shoulder shot, impossible to do normal reverses like you would use. So it was the beginning of an utterly different cinematic language, and it resulted later in 2001 in the 70-millimeter version of Cinerama. And Kubrick used to joke about his job was to make How the Universe Was one. And we thought that was pretty funny because he felt that he had an obligation to make this epic spectacle, not just a normal movie, but an epic spectacle, and he wanted to transport the audience into space. He wanted it to be like a first-person experience. So I'm going to show this little 10-minute clip. It speaks for itself, and it'll get the whole show rolling, and you'll know why I got hooked on all these crazy film formats, and I'm going to take you through almost everything I've done in all these zillions of years. If you ever want to see that whole documentary, it's really quite excellent. So this led to 2001 being shot, as they described, in 70 millimeter, and I'm going to start getting into 2001 and tell you a little bit about that. I'm going to take you through all these different movies, 2001, Close Encounters, Blade Runner, etc., and show you how they're kind of linked together in my mind. So 2001, you know, you have a little storyboard drawing. A lot of the storyboard drawings we work with are very simple, sketches almost, but you see shots in the movie, and then you see the moon bus, and that was one of my first tasks on 2001 as a young man. I was probably maybe 24, starting to detail these miniatures and trying to make them look photorealistic, even though they were just fiberglass models with not much detail. And we started figuring out how to put detail and painting. And actually, since I was an illustrator, I was actually painting with my airbrush right on the model to create different panels of texture and brightness and reflection, and trying to make it look as big as we possibly could. And then I got involved in shooting some of these miniatures. Kubrick really got to like me and what I was able to do, and so I got into designing some of these shots like this, where each of these was a 1,000-watt light bulb out of a slide projector, and this was the painting back here, and this is the moon bus that's going to land, and it's mounted on this rod back here. It's kind of tilting up and down, has nitrogen coming through the nozzles of the supposedly jet engines or rocket engines to stir up all this dust. And I was in charge of the animation department, and this was one of the shots looking down on the little moon base. So it's a photograph of a plaster model that's now had little holes drilled in it, and there's lights coming in from behind. We used a lot of lens flares and a lot of natural kind of photographic lens phenomena to try to make things look real. And this whole technique of mounting two-dimensional flat photographs of the models on a giant sheet of glass and then being able to project little movies into the windows. You'll see a lot of shots in 2001 where there's really not any perspective shifts going on because it's a two-dimensional photograph. And we had to mount it on glass in order to superimpose one thing against another. Sorry about that missing slide. So you get shots like this. Shots like this, you can see all this little detail and stuff that I got involved in creating little, streaks of grease and who knows what to try to make it look real, which George Lucas did a good job of copying in Star Wars. Tests for mats of how to make a mat so that you could composite it with something else. This is working on the big stage, one of the big stages at MGM. That's the space station set over here and the moon bus set over here. This is the moon bus set being built. Several shots of that. But very classic set construction techniques. Another missing slide, sorry. I designed a lot of these moon terrains. I had a lot of discussions with Stanley about what we thought the moon was going to look like, because nobody knew. There hadn't been any satellites or anything that really had looked at the moon's surface in any detail. And so this was kind of a Chesley Bonestell, rocky, craggy terrain kind of thing that he wanted. And I was actually going in another direction, which did not make the cut. But during that, we would build these miniatures, photograph them, and then this would be like a Polaroid of a moon bus pasted onto another photograph to kind of start designing what some of these shots might look like before we would actually commit them to production. Another miniature. This was a very early Roy Carnan illustration. That was, believe it or not, the moon bus in a very early iteration. This is one of the anamorphically squeezed work prints. We never saw, during the entire 2.5 years I was on the movie, we never actually saw a 70 millimeter print. We were working with 35 millimeter anamorphic prints. And here's me working on my moon terrain, which I thought was, in fact, in retrospect, very much like what the moon is like. It's very rounded, very soft, very eroded by micrometeorite impacts, and not craggy at all. But Kubrick didn't like it, so it didn't cut it. These are some early designs for the Jupiter sequence. The Discovery spacecraft went through a zillion different iterations. The Stargate was going to be a slot inside one of Jupiter's moons that they go into. This was actually a very early hypothetical rendering of what the pod might look like at a very early stage. This slot in one of Jupiter's moons was going to be another little universe down there that didn't belong in our universe, and they had to go down there. And these are like 2 pods looking down here. They're going to send little probes down. There's a whole bunch of things that were designed, written, experimented with, drawn, discussed, and deleted over time. You can see a little bit of the Discovery design here with the pod bay doors and the cockpit, but the ship itself went away. This movie went through tremendous development. So the thing I'm talking about today is all the whole kind of creative process of how you tackle a problem, work on it, discuss it, solve it, change it, and try to come up with a new solution to make something on the screen that people have not seen before. One of our problems on the movie was the Earth. And one of the illustrators on the movie was really, really struggling to paint the Earth. This is actually a flat painting. He found this technique of painting on glass. He would paint white paint on glass and then scrape it away with a razor blade and get these kind of naturalistic-looking cloudy effects, which were very successful. But we were scared to death that nobody could make a good painting of Jupiter. And prior to that, we were trying to do Saturn. That was the original objective of the movie, was to go to Saturn. And everybody said, well, we can't make Saturn, plus we can't make Saturn's rings. We have no clue how to do this. And so I told Kubrick that this technique that I developed, which I'll talk about a little bit later, I'm doing this a little out of order, the slit scan technique, could be applied to making Jupiter. And so this was a little gizmo. This is a little distorted because I'm shooting with a fisheye lens. But there's a little black, kid's ball here, and it's got a very thin white line on it, and it's rotating on this axis right here. There's a big bearing right here with little gears, so this whole thing can rotate. So this projector here, which is a little opaque projector that artists use to put some piece of art up onto their canvas, would actually rotate around this rotating sphere and project a little image, which is rotating inside there. So there's there's a shaft going down that's rotating the artwork here. The shaft goes along here, comes down to some gears. There's a little motor here. It goes down to here and rotates this whole thing. And I photographed this in a completely darkened room with nothing but that little rim illuminated by the projector. And this was my first test of Jupiter to validate that we could, in fact, make a spherical planet out of a piece of flat artwork. And so I would regularly take these little experiments down to Stanley's office and say, I think we can do Jupiter. And he would look at my little Polaroid and he'd say, yep, looks good to me. I think we could do it. Let's go for it. So he would authorize me to order whatever equipment, buy whatever gizmos, lenses, optics, mechanical parts, whatever, and I'd go into London and find stuff in surplus stores and started experimenting with various kinds of exposures and ways to look at different perspective with patterns and validate that we could in fact make a spherical image. And then I built this device we call the Jupiter machine. And I'm going to describe this, but basically this is this little slit again. Now it's much larger. There is a black axis here and a big bearing down under here. And there's a projector here and a projector here. This projector is projecting the bottom half of the slit. This projector is projecting the top half of the slit. And the entire, I'm not allowed to use the word gizmo, but I have to say it, the device would rotate 360 degrees. Over here, there's 8x10 still cameras with Ektachrome film in them, and it would take maybe 6 hours to make one exposure. So this thing is rotating very, very slowly. This room has to be completely blacked out. Nobody can go in there. I even had to have the electrical department dedicate one electrical line from one generator just to this room, because if anybody plugged their appliance in or turned on a light anywhere else on the stage, it would change the exposure, which would make my exposure uneven. So here's a little diagram of that thing. So you got your 8x10 camera looking at this thing. This slit has got a projector shining on the top half of it. This slit got a projector on the bottom half of it, and the whole gizmo or device rotates 360 degrees with a little motor here. And even to stabilize the smoothness of the motion, I had a little shaft that came down to these paddles that were made out of erector sets. And we had a vat. This was a 70 millimeter film can filled with molasses or honey or something. I can't remember what it was. To just smooth out the motion. And so a projector would be like this, a lens, a slit inside the projector, a piece of rotating transparency artwork, condensing lenses, and a light, and a motor rotating this artwork. And then I had to design this painting, which would be one circular painting, and one half of it would represent the northern hemisphere of Jupiter, and the other half of the painting would represent the southern hemisphere of Jupiter. So I made this painting because I am an artist, and I was able to get my airbrush and my watercolors and my gouache, paint this on a piece of cardboard. So the painting is really in two halves. This represented the lower half of Jupiter, which was going to have the red spot, and the upper half of Jupiter. And then around the edge, it's the same, because I was going to kind of feather those two together with a little bit of a blur right around the equator. So I took that painting, photographed it, split it in half. Lost that slide. So you get, these are some of my early exposure tests where I bumped the camera during each exposure, so there's a little different alignment. But anyway, you start seeing the painting is now scanned onto this hemispherical surface, and it results in Jupiter as one contiguous exposure. If you look at this very, very closely, you'll see these anomalous scan lines here, which are, in fact, slight changes in exposure from some variation in the generator or whatever. But once I airbrushed this and modified it for the animation camera, I could make it into a pretty successful Jupiter. Then I did another thing, which was that I painted the red spot as a circle, knowing that I could alter the scan. And when the slit scans 180 degrees of the surface of Jupiter, the artwork was only moving about 90 degrees. So it's taking the art and stretching it about a 2-to-1 ratio, like an anamorphic lens, which gave it a kind of a sense of, I don't know, motion or dynamics, atmosphere or something. Anyway, this was very successful, and we used it in a lot of shots, which did not get into the movie. We had every conceivable orientation of Jupiter and its moons. The shooting ratio in 2001 was about 200 to 1. So for every shot you see, there's 199 more that you not. This is one of Jupiter's moons, which I did by, they were much smaller, but I had about a 1-foot diameter white plexiglass hemisphere that was my screen, and I projected on it with 2 slide projectors. And in the slide projectors, I had glass plate slides that I just painted right on the slides and get all this weird reticulated paint. So that's actually just blobs of paint that have dried on the slide, and I project them onto the surface and get the moon, and then I airbrush the terminator on the moon, and it starts looking pretty much like one of what Jupiter's moons actually turned out to look like. So I was pretty happy with that. So again, the Stargate was this idea. No one could figure out how to do it. We built this, or I built this big thing called the Slit scan machine. This is a big light table here. This was about 4 feet across and about 12 feet long, lit with fluorescent lights, and we could build our artwork for the slit scan effect on this big table. And it was built of hundreds and hundreds of high contrast lithographs of electron microscope photographs, op art from magazines, patterns, textures, colors, zipatone patterns, everything we could think of in a zillion colored gels. And then this artwork was positioned on a giant sheet of glass and moved behind a slit. And I can't explain this in any orderly way, but here's this crazy machine I built called the slit scan machine. So you have here a 65 millimeter camera. You have a slit on the right and a slit on the left. And this camera is on a dolly, so it can move toward and back from this slit. So at the farthest back position, the camera's about 15 feet from the slit. And at the closest position, it's 1.5 inches from the slit. And while the camera is moving in, the artwork is moving behind the slit. And it's actually shot in 2 passes, one for the right slit and one for the left slit. And we'd slightly pan the camera a little bit to pull these 2 slits together as kind of joined in infinity. And then over here's my little control box, which looks like that. Not very hard to build, a bunch of relays and circuits and switches that sequence this thing. I actually used photographic darkroom timers to run this whole thing, and just limit switches at the ends to automatically reverse the motors and do all this sequencing. And then I had to get the camera to focus automatically during these 1-minute exposures from 15 feet to 1.5 inches, which would take about a minute. And during that minute, I had this little cam that was there's a bearing right there on a shaft that's following this cam rotation, which is on a rotating motor. This is a Selson motor that's driving that through some gears. And so the camera's here, the lens is here, and so the lens can slide back and forth. So each frame of film actually includes 1 million different focal positions, because the slit had to be in focus the whole way. So that became a tricky thing. So here's a kind of a diagram of the device. It's got a big lead screw and a motor here that drives the camera in and out. It's looking at the slit, 1 slit at a time. The artwork, which is back here, is moving behind the slit, and behind the artwork are very bright lights. And normally when I moved about 15 feet here, I might have only moved the artwork about 8 inches, which created this weird stretching effect, like I was doing on Jupiter. This actually was done first, but it's just a whole optical idea that's similar to what's called a streak camera, which is often used at a racetrack, or I don't know what they do digitally now, but they would have a camera at a racetrack right at the finish line, and the camera had a very thin slit in it, and the film would be moving past the slit very fast as the horses cross the finish line, and it creates a stretched photograph. But you can see the exact moment that the horse's nose crosses the finish line. And that was one version of a streak camera. They're used a lot, even today, as line scan cameras for all kinds of medical and scientific work. But in these days, my idea was to simply take the idea of having a shutter in a movie camera and removing the shutter from the camera and putting the shutter as a slit out into the world. So this is a complete break of the concept of what a camera is supposed to do, or what time is, or what space is. And so this was a pretty successful effect, and it was a lot of fun doing it. It was tedious because each side of the streak would be a minute, so that's 2 minutes, and then another minute for each side to go back to one before you'd shoot the next frame. So it's 4 minutes per frame, and the whole thing was automated and would run 24 hours a day by itself until something would break. And we had to have crews on this thing in a darkened room around the clock to churn out all the streak photography for 2001. So, these are a lot of, failed shots that didn't get into the cut. And I'm going to keep moving on here because I'm trying to show you so much today. So one of the sad things is a photographer did discover one miniature from 2001. Everything on the movie got destroyed. The sets were destroyed. The miniatures were destroyed on purpose. Kubrick did not want them to end up in somebody else's sci-fi movie. So the space station ended up in a dump. This was about 10 years ago. And it was found, and the poor photographer who grabbed these pictures didn't have the presence of mind to grab the damn thing and put it in his trunk. So anyway, I'm going through these pretty quickly. I did a huge show on 2001 last night, so I'm moving on to all this different projects, because 2001 for me led to my going back to LA, starting my own little company, doing a lot of television commercials and trying to get my feet wet back in the industry. But 2001 was a great calling card, and so I was very fortunate to have a chance to write and direct Silent Running, my own first directorial project. And I'll just show you a little bit of that and tell you a little bit about how we did it. So after I made Silent Running, a couple of problems happened in my career. One was that Lou Wasserman, who was the head of Universal Studios, who had decided to make Silent Running as part of a 5-picture experimental project, which followed on the making of Easy Rider. Easy Rider completely shocked the movie industry because it was a low-budget independent film with Peter Fonda and several other terrific actors. But it was made for nothing. It made a lot of money in the box office, and Universal decided to experiment and allow 5 films to be made where they would not interfere with the process at all. They didn't even want to know what they were. They were just going to pick 5 directors and say, do whatever you want, as long as it's under $1 million budget. And Silent Running was one of those, along with The Last Picture Show and several others. So I got to make this movie, but then the next experiment that Lou Wasserman wanted to do was it possible for a movie to carry itself with word of mouth and no advertising campaign? Well, no one heard about Silent Running when it came out, and it didn't do very well in the box office. And so that really hurt my career, but the movie was well received, and I got into film development deals in almost all the major studios for various kinds of science fiction movies, which is what I like to do. And I had a movie at MGM called Pyramid. We had the screenplay completed. We were going to shoot on a lot of terrific locations, including the site of the Montreal World's Fair was going to be our kind of futuristic city. But then Kirk Kerkorian, who owned MGM, decided to close the studio and build a casino in Las Vegas. So my movie ended. I had another project with Arthur Jacobs, who had produced the Planet of the Apes films, and we were going to do this big, spectacular underwater sci-fi movie called Journey of the Oceanauts. And then he died, and the project got tied up in his estate. And I had a film was called The Ride. It was actually about the whole idea of simulation rides as a form of entertainment and how narcotic it could be. And that ended because there was a change of management at Fox. And I'm saying, oh my God, this is development hell. That's why they call it development hell, because you don't make any money while you're developing a screenplay. So I was really suffering, trying to figure out, well, how am I going to get ahead, because my career as a director is being kind of sidelined. So I convinced Paramount Pictures to start a research and development unit called Future General Corporation, which was a subsidiary of Paramount Pictures. They owned most of it, but I had tremendous creative freedom, particularly in our first year of activity at this little company down in Marina del Rey. They funded me to do whatever I wanted, really. And in that time, we developed the Showscan film process, which was an experiment in media itself. And my partner, Richard Urisic, and I started renting old movie cameras like Cinerama cameras, Panavision cameras, Ultra Panavision cameras, CinemaScope lenses, and we tried different kinds of screens. And we shot test movies, and we projected these test movies, and we tried all kinds of things. And we were not impressed. We weren't finding anything that we thought was really dramatically different or different enough to justify some new technology. And we realized only after we did that the one thing we hadn't tried was changing the frame rate of movies. And we started doing some experiments, shooting at 24, 36, 48, 60, 66, and 72 frames per second, and actually set up a laboratory test, which I'll show you in a minute, where we hooked individuals up to electrocardiogram, electroencephalogram, galvanic skin response, electromyogram, to map their physiological stimulation as a result of changing the frame rate. And that was when I discovered in about 1975 that when you increase the frame rate, the excitement of a movie dramatically increases. I mean, 5 to 10 times more. And we settled on 60 frames a second, developed the Showscan process, and that was why I started wanting to round up old 65 millimeter movie cameras and optical equipment in support of this. We also built the first simulator ride, which was the idea of adapting flight simulation technology to entertainment. And we built a mock-up of that and made a 35 millimeter movie, which we projected in it while it was moving on hydraulic things with seats inside. And that, I'll make a long story short, became ultimately the Back to the Future ride and a lot of other theme park attractions over the years. And we had an interactive 3D game, which I'm not going to show you. It's a little hard to show, but we thought, well, there's going to be a huge future in digital, not digital at the time. It was not digital. There was no such thing as digital. But we thought interactive games would be really cool if they actually had characters in them and dialogue and a story and a quest and a goal. And we built that. And then we built this Magicam system, which was a way of superimposing live actors on a blue screen stage into miniatures in real time by slaving the live action camera on the stage to a miniature camera on a periscope lens and matching the scale. So you could go at 1:1, 50:1, 100:1, 200:1 ratio, and it would match perfectly, and you could move through these two worlds. And it was used pretty extensively on the Cosmos television series with Carl Sagan, where he walks through the famous non-existent Library of Alexandria and alien planets and things like that. And I thought, well, this will be great. You know, this is the way, because we were at Paramount, I said, well, this is the way we ought to start shooting Star Trek, because you guys already have this franchise. Wouldn't it be great to do it? Well, Paramount Pictures, I got to tell you, were completely out of it. They didn't get any of it. They didn't like any of it. They said there was no future in any of it. They wouldn't give me a go-ahead on any of it, and I was just really frustrated. So anyway, Showscan was this 60-frame, 70-millimeter giant screen thing that was way better than Cinerama and way better than IMAX in 1975. The simulation ride was this whole idea of hydraulic motion base and a capsule with people inside, which I'll show you later, became the Back to the Future ride for me, which was a lot of fun. And then another ride called Cineride, which never came to pass, which was really cool, and I'm sure we're going to do this pretty soon, was projecting multiple Showscan films in a dark ride situation, and you're in a vehicle. And we filmed these films knowing that the vehicle would be moving at 30 feet a second, or 30 feet a minute. And so we filmed it with the camera moving 30 feet a minute and projected these films into domes, and then had foreground sets that were all moving in perspective to the perspective shift in the movie, and it was all 60 frame, and it was so real that everybody believed that everything that they were seeing was happening in real time, including explosions, breakaway glass, mummies, monsters, you name it. It was really wild, but the theme park industry really just wanted to do roller coaster rides. They didn't get it. So we had these simulator rides that were like this, the idea of a capsule with a bunch of people inside looking out a window at some movie and then having these hydraulics underneath. And so we did all kinds of developments of various kinds of capsule vehicles, which ultimately became very much like the Back to the Future ride. So here's an underwater simulator. We started developing special electronic 70-millimeter projectors that could run 60 frames a second electronically, did not have a mechanical Geneva movement in them. I designed and built theaters. This was the Toshiba Pavilion at Expo in Japan. Very steeply raked seating and giant screens. And one of the things this Showscan thing led to was an experimental film, which I'm sorry I can't show you, but we knew the size and shape of the screen. And so I devised this thing. I said, well, if we shoot in Showscan and we project it in exact same scale as the theater itself, I'm going to do this illusion. And so we had this scene where we projected a really bad movie on the screen that was kind of a fake documentary, and we made everything go wrong that you could possibly think of. It goes out of frame, it goes out of focus, the film burns in the gate, it's just terrible, and it fails. And people would come knowing this was Doug Trumbull's demo of a new film process. And they'd be very embarrassed for me because it was actually a 60 frame per second, 70-millimeter movie photographing a 24 frame per second, 35-millimeter movie that had everything wrong with it. And so they actually believed that what was happening was real. Then the projectionist leaves the projection booth, goes around the theater, comes behind the screen, turns on a work light back there, because, you know, screens are perforated, you can see through them. If there was a light back there, you'd see the speakers behind the screen. So he does that, and so you see the speakers in there. There's this big roll-up door. There's a door he comes through, and he comes up to the audience and touches the screen, which is catching the light from these house lights, and starts talking to the audience, apologizing for screwing up the show. It looked absolutely real. It was indistinguishable from reality. And his feet are on the ground, and he's 6 feet tall, and it was all in scale to my theater. And heavyweight people like Steven Spielberg and George Lucas and Coppola and everybody came to my screenings. And when I would get to this point, they would get up out of their seat and start leaving the theater, shaking my hand, say, Doug, you know, whenever you get it fixed, you know, give me a call. I'll see if I can get it in my schedule to come back. And it wasn't until they were off to the side of the theater they realized they'd been completely fooled. And this, to me, was a really important moment in movie history. And this little movie called New Magic has actually been requested by the Academy to be archived there. And I'm hoping we can get it digitally scanned so we can show it again in high definition pretty soon. So just moving on, because I'm trying to tell you the whole picture, and this is all going to, I hope, fit together in your minds as we go forward. while I was doing Showscan and suffering all these setbacks at the studio, I was purposefully buying 70 millimeter cameras, 65 millimeter negative, optical printers, and all kinds of stuff to be able to do visual effects for my movies. And I was asked by Steven Spielberg to do the effects for Close Encounters, and I met him, I liked him, I thought he was amazing, I thought Jaws was amazing. I thought, well, strategically this will work for me because I'm not doing anything for Paramount. I'm under contract. They won't let me do my thing. They won't let Showscan or any of these other things go ahead. So I agreed to do the effects for Close Encounters as a way of making some money and also amassing a lot of special 70 millimeter camera equipment. So I'll show you a little bit of Close Encounters. So we had to study the terrain that Spielberg wanted to depict. He wanted to talk about Muncie, Indiana. This was all actually shot in Mobile, Alabama. But we went down there and shot photographs and tried to get the lay of the land and see what it actually looked like. And then Greg Jean would build a miniature like this of that intersection with the telephone poles and the trees. This is all kind of HO model scale miniature. That's Greg working away. So you kind of get a feeling for the scale of the miniature, and you saw that shot. So it's just a lot of lighting, a lot of smoke, a lot of depth of field issues, and then we've got the truck here, the camera here, the beam splitter here. I'm sorry you can't see it very well, but this is a 45-degree 50-50 mirror, and then behind that is the projector that's going to project the movie out the window. So all these shots, I like to talk about process, kind of creative process, is you have to plan it, you have to have a script idea, you have to draw it, you have to find the location for it, you make a storyboard for it, you find the location, which was actually a real place in Mobile, Alabama. We had problems on this set actually because at the week we were shooting this set in Mobile, the Ku Klux Klan was doing some kind of a march in town. And Richard Dreyfuss actually went on television and made some derogatory remarks about the Ku Klux Klan, who started driving by our set all the day with guns and things. It was very frightening. So we had to have a lot of security while we were shooting this sequence. That's the production manager out there. This is a little bit more like what it looked like when we actually shot. And then we're going to go to what we called Crescendo Summit, which was another set, which was shot inside an airplane hangar. And we knew we had, this is kind of the dimensions of this big airplane hangar in Mobile that was right next to another airplane hangar where we shot the end sequence. And this was actually a giant pile of dirt brought into the airplane hangar, mounded up, paved with asphalt, so they could drive in at high speed. Cop cars could drive in through one hangar door, go by fast, and go out the other hangar door. And so we had to plan this whole thing. It's a really interesting process. So we built this little miniature, put little miniature cars, little miniature fences and terrain and stuff like that, and shot a lot of different angles of it with my Nikon camera. And then we take these angles and paint what we figured out was going to have to be out there beyond this set. And this was planned to be a 100-foot wide front projection screen that could roll around the stage to position from shot to shot, which we built for the movie, and we built a big 8x10 front projection machine that was similar in function to the one Tommy Howard built for Close Encounters, for 2001, but much lighter and smaller and much more easy to move around. So this was kind of a representation of the screen, our little miniature, and this terrain out there, which we had to build as miniatures. So we had to work out all the angles that Steven Spielberg could conceivably shoot. We didn't know exactly what he would shoot, so we had to plan for pretty broad coverage in all directions and then design these paintings that would be outside there and figure out, well, how are we going to do that? So we would do these drawings and say, well, this is going to be the set in the foreground here, and this is going to be this miniature that we're going to build of this Mobile, Alabama terrain and a sky. And then we'd build a miniature like this on a table, so using this forced perspective technique that we'd used on 2001, where the distance from this edge of the table to the back edge of the table is only about 8 feet. But using forced lines of perspective and grading the rough here, medium here, and fine here, you kind of grade the scale and force the perspective off to synthetic vanishing points. Then you add the sky, a little sky glow there, and then you get a plate that starts looking like these 8x10, what we call a plate, a transparency that can be put inside the projector to project onto the set. And this was one where we actually had some little city lights off in the distance, Another shot of one of the tables. Some of the little tiny trees from HO trains, little farmhouses. This is one of the angles of just one of the little lighting rig we were testing out here. And then you storyboard this sequence and work, Steven Spielberg is working with his own artist to figure out, well, how are we going to stage this scene? Then you get a scene that kind of looks like this. So that's just one example of, solving problems to meet, this kind of very extraordinary needs of a movie like this, using these techniques of projecting this image out there onto this giant 100-foot wide screen. Because the projector and the camera are on exactly the same optical axis, they're lined up to where that 45-degree mirror is perfectly aligned to where they are actually casting a shadow on the screen behind them. But since it's all on the same axis, the shadow is filled by them. This is the same as 2001 in the Dawn of Man sequence, where I learned about this technique. So I built a very small machine for silent running, and then we built a much larger 8x10 machine for close encounters to do these sequences. And built a lot of these miniatures. Like this was one of the shots where that little red guy went by this little billboard down here. Another forced perspective miniature with another miniature behind it. This was all shot as one. And then the UFOs, which are going to pass over, were planned. And you can see us, shooting that little miniature you just saw. You can see that it tapers down. It's all forced perspective. This is Greg Jean, who masterminded all the miniatures, including the Mothership, which I'll show you in a minute. So the UFOs were, I don't have very good pictures of them, but they're just shapes made out of plexiglass and plastic with a lot of neon inside. And a lot of them were designed to be faces. They were kind of anthropomorphic. There would always be eyes or ears or antennas or some weird kind of strange shape, but it's really just kind of a conical object. And once it's photographed, there's a tremendous amount of glow and brightness and lens flares that cover it up and start making it very magical and mystical. This was one that kind of has teeth. You see that coming over the mountain at the end of the movie. And then shooting the UFOs are about that big relative to the camera here. This camera is on a big track. That's Dave Stewart, the cameraman. And the UFOs never move. In movies, one of the things about miniatures is that they rarely move. The camera does the moving. Because you have a miniature and you have lights on the miniature, you can't move the miniature and the lights and everything else. So you move the camera instead. Very simple technique. This was the real Devil's Tower in Wyoming, where we shot on location for the live action. And then we had to build a miniature Devil's Tower at our studio, and then build this whole area around Devil's Tower with trees and mountains and this little opening here where we'd be able to superimpose the set that we'd photographed in Mobile, Alabama. So the set would fit in here, and the rocks all around the edge of the set would merge with our miniature rocks, and we could composite the whole thing. So this is another angle, very hard to tell, but the camera is here looking through some black velvet. Here's the miniature, there's Devil's Tower, and here's all the lighting rigs and stuff to move lights that interact with the miniature UFOs that are going to fly by. This was a miniature that was built by the production design. It's the only Polaroid I have of it, of an early design for that whole landing field, which turned out to be rectangular rather than semicircular. We would be faxing designs back and forth between us and Spielberg on location sometimes, and planning how we would put all these rocks around the live action set and how we'd add this painting of the sky in the background using illustrations like this. That's another shot of the miniature waiting for the live action to be superimposed. This is the stage in an airplane hangar in Mobile, Alabama, on this giant airplane hangar. So there's lights up in the ceiling. There's some rocks around the edge. And then this is early on when that set was being built. So you can see the airplane hangar here and the rocks and foreground rocks and all this stuff being added in. It was a humongous set. So they were playing with Spielberg, trying to make him feel happy, like he was the only next guy since C.B. DeMille that did something of this scale, like Intolerance. So you really just have to see Close Encounters. I'm going to bounce through some of this a little faster because the show's taking a little bit too long to show. But we try to plan these shots. We built the first live-action motion control system so we could actually record the movement of the camera on location so that we could add miniatures to those shots in post-production with camera movement occurring. It was the first time it was ever done successfully using digital motion control systems. So this was done in this tank. And so here's the 70 millimeter camera that would shoot at about 72 frames a second. This is a big water tank, which right here is empty. But overhead, I've got this manipulator arm up here that goes from a little handle here, up through here, through there, and back down into the tank. And I learned about this when I was working on the Andromeda strain, where they had these sets of hot rooms for nuclear materials, where people couldn't actually touch the materials. They had to do it remotely. And I worked out a way to actually use those. We rented one of those manipulators, and I used it as a three-dimensional painting tool so that I could actually paint those clouds in 3D in the water tank in real time. And I could just move I had a little pipette sticking into the tank, and I could move it anywhere in the tank and then pull a little trigger, and the milk would come out. And the bottom half of the tank was filled with salt water, cold salt water, and the top half of the tank was filled with warm fresh water. And so there was a kind of a inversion layer of specific gravity, so that the paint was designed, it would be a little heavier than the fresh water, but lighter than the salt water. So it would come down, but really generally not penetrate that boundary layer and start flowing horizontally, like clouds do, with a natural inversion layer of the atmosphere. Then there was the Mothership. This was a design that was actually done by Ralph McQuarrie, who designed Star Wars. And he came and worked for us to help us design the Mothership. And this was like a whole idea of kind of a Manhattan skyline up here to create this almost a little floating city to give it a sense of scale that you could relate to. And this is the miniature under construction. You can kind of see the scale of it. Camera with the Mothership, a close-up. You know, funny little things like HO scale, train lights, all kinds of junk was on this miniature. There's actually a little R2-D2 there that you can see in one of the shots. So this is the Mothership lit up, but with no smoke yet, and we shot it in heavy smoke to create this beautiful atmospheric glow. This was the underbelly of the Mothership, which was a separate miniature that's upside down there, but we built this thing, and then we put it up sideways so we could project patterns onto it to create these patterns that you see in the scenes later on in the movie. So this is just some examples of those patterns being projected using the 8x10 machine, and we had rotating moire patterns going on inside the projector of two textures counter-rotating to create all these twinkly, magical effects. And then this little mechanized device that comes down that matches the full-scale set piece on the location. So I'm going to move on here, but Close Encounters was another example of a project that required the first variable speed motion control system, which was way better than anything we devised for 2001, because there were no digital computers at the time of 2001. But we were the first people to actually use PDP-11s and small microprocessors to control digitally controlled stepper motors. And then we were the first to use these miniature laser beam controlled stabilized environment to create smoke, so we could have a smoke environment for hours at a time that was exactly the same all the time, because the exposures were sometimes 10 seconds a frame and it had to be constant. So I'm going to move on. So we built this motion control machine, 8 channels of digital motion control that could drive all these motors that are on the camera to pan, tilt, focus, move down the track, etc. Much more sophisticated than anything we had on 2001. These are these digital stepper motors that drive everything on here mechanically. I just have to move through it quickly. So here we are shooting the Mothership. There's a track here to move the camera because the Mothership is fixed. It never moves. The camera does all the moving. It's Greg Jean, built the Mothership. So pretty soon after Close Encounters, we were asked by Ridley Scott to do Blade Runner. And that was really a fortuitous thing, because I was about to direct Brainstorm. Ridley Scott wanted these effects for Blade Runner. Blade Runner was a very low-budget movie. And I'm going to do a big show about Blade Runner tonight at 8 o'clock if any of you want to come to that. It's much more extensive than I can do here. But Blade Runner is the beneficiary of Close Encounters, because all the techniques that we worked out for Close Encounters worked for Blade Runner. And you'll see very much similar techniques that we used in the Mothership became the blimp in Blade Runner. Looks almost identical, same lens flares, same technique, same lighting, same miniature style, same motion control. The UFOs in Close Encounters led to the spinners in Blade Runner. And so it was a very quick job for us to do without much effort. I mean, I'm not saying there wasn't much effort, but it was a much lower budget, a much faster paced job. And I'll talk about that in much greater detail later, but I'll show you a little bit of it. So Blade Runner, in short, was really benefited from the fact we'd already done a lot of this and could hit the ground running. So during Blade Runner, I had already prearranged this in my contract, was that I had to move on because I was directing Brainstorm for MGM. And my partner, Richard Yursich, and I, who was going to be the director of photography on Brainstorm, we turned over the job to Dave Dreyer, and you'll see a lot of him tonight in the Blade Runner show. Really great guy who kind of carried the torch and finished all the effect shots for Blade Runner for us. So I think I have a clip here with Roger Ebert. I hope it shows up. But Brainstorm was designed and written and conceived on purpose to be the first film to introduce the Showscan film process. Because the management at Paramount changed, the new guy came in, he said, guys, if we don't make a movie in this process, we're fools. And so the mandate to Barry Diller and Michael Eisner and Jeff Katzenberg was for me to make Brainstorm in Showscan. Unfortunately, there were a lot of other things that went wrong, and there was this kind of business problem, which was that the theaters said, well, we're not going to put in a bunch of projectors to show this movie unless all the movies from Hollywood are made in Showscan. And we couldn't make that happen. And the studios, all the other studios said, well, we're not going to start making movies in Showscan. We all love it. I mean, I'd showed this to everybody in the industry. We all love it, but we're not going to do it unless all the theaters will show it. So it was kind of a catch-22 that no one would put their foot forward and make the commitment to start transforming the movie industry into a higher frame rate technology. So I couldn't get that to happen, and I had to make Brainstorm conventionally. So I'll show you a little bit more about that. These were these kind of memory bubbles with each one of these bubbles has a little movie that's a memory in some kind of huge matrix-like space. Louise Fletcher has this big out-of-body experience and floats up through the ceiling of her lab. Whether you want to call this heaven or infinity or whatever, it was kind of a depiction of some other realm in time and space, a la 2001, that was really supposed to be actually inside of an atomic particle. And we made all these atomic particles moving and all these little movies inside, and then we had to build all this weird equipment to make these memory bubbles. So this was like a big curved track here with a 4x5 camera and these backlit bubbles, and we'd shoot them over and over and over and create these multiple exposures of these matrices of memories, and then superimpose other memories in front of that. So you can see the track system a little bit better here. I'm not going to go into it, but it was similar to some stuff we actually ended up using on the V'ger Cloud for Star Trek: The Motion Picture as well. Blue screen photography, storyboards, me directing. This is an interesting moment because, as you all know, or you may know, Natalie Wood died during production. It's a horrible, tragic story, and it took me almost a year to get the movie back on track. The studio wanted to abandon the movie. They wanted to make a $15 million insurance claim. They didn't want this movie finished. They shut us down the minute she died. And I said, guys, there's no problem finishing this movie because she's done. I only had 3 minor shots to do. I tried to show them that we could cut the movie without Natalie Wood, but they were determined to not finish the movie, and I actually got the movie finished on money from the insurance company, which was, you see, Lloyd's of London presents Brainstorm, coming soon to a theater near you, which everybody on the crew wore these bright red T-shirts. And it was all about these tapes of people's memories and experiences. And there was a lot of business with Natalie Wood and her husband, R.J. Wagner, and certainly no implication that I would have anything to do with Natalie Wood, but there was that she was, I think, doing a fabulous job on this movie. So it has a lot of stuff that I really couldn't fully finish as I would have done if I'd had the money with the proper budget in the time. But we actually got this movie made, and I'm pretty proud of it in spite of its shortcomings. And that's Richard Urasich, big fisheye lens. Weird, distorted images inside the lab when the machine's not quite working right. So that's one of the cameras we built. This was this lab where we did these tests. We had multiple projectors rigged up on a screen, and all this electrocardiogram, electroencephalogram testing of individuals looking at these films, and we built these electronic projectors that could show 60 frames automatically and electronically under computer control. We built portable automated projectors that could be put into flight simulators. The first one was actually here at the CN Tower called Tour of the Universe. This was a 747 size flight simulator base on a big hydraulic motion base, a little loading door here, for Tour of the Universe, which was then copied by Lucas to do Star Tours for Disney. And then we tried various kinds of moving seats for Showscan films and completely freaked people out, and built big theaters for World's Fairs and Expos. Designing theaters, so I've had a lot of experience designing theaters for this process where the screen is virtually wall-to-wall and floor-to-ceiling and curved more like Cinerama had been, and shot this film called New Magic where it was indistinguishable from reality. And did other things for World's Fairs. This was up in British Columbia for an expo up there, and we built this simulator inside this little building that was an underwater simulator as though you were in a bubble submersible. We made a whole movie that happens outside this window while people are standing inside this simulator, and it was indistinguishable from reality. So it was extremely immersive, superior to IMAX, but IMAX really owned the giant screen business, and we couldn't get much business traction on it. But I'm currently working on a digital version of Showscan now, which can be done because this Catch-22 doesn't exist anymore. Digital projectors, this digital projector right now is cruising at 144 frames a second. You don't notice it because we're not sending it 144 frames. We're only sending it 24, and they're all being repeated. But it has the capability to go at very high frame rates with very minor modifications. So anyway, subsequent to getting out of my contract, I started developing this ride film system of simulation rides and merged my company with IMAX and took IMAX public. So I think it was really the IMAX 3D that enabled and validated the whole idea of 3D, which led to Avatar and all the 3D movies we're seeing now, because it proved that there was an audience for it, and IMAX showed that any movie that was shown in IMAX 3D versus the same movie in 35 millimeter in an identical location would gross 8 times the revenues. So they validated the idea that the public really wanted a 3D experience, and that's really what really led to all the 3D developments. And so that stuff was shot at the big Sony theater. It's one of the largest screens in the world. It's actually a 100-foot wide screen, larger than the Cinerama screens and much taller. And these glasses, which were really fantastic because they had a sound system in them for binaural sound, which made an incredibly realistic spatialized sound effect. And these big double projectors, 2 70mm 15 perf movies simultaneously for 3D. And this was the projector we used for the Back to the Future ride. This was the first integrated 3D IMAX camera called the Solido camera, which was 2 lenses and 2 pieces of film and 2 movements inside one camera body. And these are some of the IMAX promotional stuff of how, if you saw a regular movie, it would be just a small screen, but in IMAX, it's a giant screen, so the 3D effect can come much closer to you and much more in your face before it actually hits the edge of the screen. Layouts for IMAX theaters, very steeply raked seating. And then the IMAX dome process, which was ordinarily used for planetariums, became the process we used for the Back to the Future ride. So just showing this because for the Back to the Future ride, we had 12 DeLorean cars parked here instead of seats with a hemispherical screen all around. We did the Back to the Future ride. So I'll show you a little bit of that. This was an amazing project to work on. It was a heck of a lot of fun, and it was finally a validation that these ideas that were being turned down by Paramount Pictures years before of simulation entertainment had now matured and actually was viable, and it became the most successful attraction that Universal ever built. Now, most directors, when you get asked to do a movie, might be asked by some production manager, how much film do you want? I got asked, how much hydraulic fluid do you want? And it was actually a very real question, because they had to know how many pumps they needed and how many reservoirs of hydraulic fluid and how much motion there was going to be. So I had to, in my brain, pre-design the entire Back to the Future ride and design a kind of a continuity and an orchestration of the motions that I thought we would be needing. And we actually built this temporary. This was the motion base that was used in the real ride, 8 seats. We put in sandbags to represent the weight of the audience, and I programmed this whole thing so we could figure out how much they would need, because they were going to have to order these pumps and deliver them. This was a gas working on this project, believe me. And we had to work out this whole choreography of matching the physical motion of the motion base to the trajectory of the camera so as not to induce motion sickness, which most simulator rides do, because very few people have figured this out. But we did a whole choreography of matching the motion and then photographing tests on the stage with miniature cameras, and then processing. We had to set up our own film lab at my studio, because we were in an old textile mill in Massachusetts. And about an hour and a half later, we could get the black and white film out of the lab, put it in the IMAX projector, project it on the screen, sync it up with the motion that we'd programmed, and see if it felt right. And see how we would create and induce a sense of euphoria in the audience and a sense of huge stimulation and excitement. And we worked this out. It's very complicated. It's never been documented. It's never been codified in the industry, and nobody really knows how to do it except me. So if you want a simulator ride, give me a call. But the IMAX cameras weighed 150 pounds, and they were huge, and we couldn't put them inside of a miniature, so we actually had to build miniature IMAX cameras for this show. This was a 40 millimeter Zeiss Distagon lens. We built this tiny little camera with a little 50-foot load of film, because all the shots were very short, with motion control like you've seen before. But this whole camera is only about a foot square, and it could fit inside the miniatures. And then we had to build a theater at my studio, which had a dome screen, one of the DeLorean cars, and this whole sound mixing and motion recording operation. And we set up the motion base with the hydraulic pumps and half a DeLorean car with the seats, so we could figure this whole thing out, because we were working in this 180-degree field of view film process that was completely immersive. And I thought this was just the most fun I'd ever had, of dealing with a motion picture project to where you're actually in the movie rather than looking at the movie. So this, to me, was a big cinema experience that tied in with all this giant screen, IMAX, Showscan, Cinerama type things I had been trying to get to. So the Back to the Future ride was just a hugely satisfying thing for me. We had to build these motion control booms. That was one of the little cameras there. This is one of the big terrain miniatures where we dive into an ice crevasse. The stuff was just really beautiful. We had a fantastic crew, and it was an amazing experience building this ride. It's 3 minutes and 58 seconds of high speed, high intensity action. And I think I'll be able to show you that. Like, here's the dinosaur. This is a 64-channel robot. We had no computer graphics at this time, and we barely had a little bit of optical printing, so it all had to be in camera. It's very, very tricky. So we had one boom here that's supporting the camera, 64 channels of Mocon running this dinosaur, at one frame every 2 seconds or so. And then the DeLorean car, which is right there, is on 9 tiny wires going up to another boom that's over here. And there's all motion control here that's tipping and turning and moving the DeLorean car, and the wires are so microscopically thin that they don't get photographed. So we had actually 2 motion control systems working simultaneously and interacting with a 64-channel robotic monster. It was really difficult, complicated, and amazing amount of fun to make, and very satisfying to get completed. So the success of that led to another contract that my company got to do the attractions at the Luxor Hotel. I'm going to try to get through that pretty quickly, but you may know the Luxor. It's a giant pyramid in Las Vegas. This is the inside of the pyramid. It's kind of an indoor theme park with restaurants and all kinds of attractions. And we built one of the simulation ride attractions was inside this really weird kind of Mexican pyramid. So this project was really interesting because my credibility was very high because of the Back to the Future ride, and the management of the Luxor Hotel had no clue how to do theme park attractions or anything. So I got a fairly large budget to do this big experiment I wanted to do, which was that I was frustrated that theme park attractions really aren't dramatic. They're just events, whether it's a ride or whatever. And so I wanted to make a trilogy of attractions. They wanted 3 attractions. I said, well, let's link the 3 attractions together as one story, and one attraction will be the first act, the next attraction will be the second act, and the third act will be the third attraction. And each of them will be using a different technology, but they're going to be common characters and a common story linking the whole thing together. If you did this right, it was quite successful. But I couldn't convince them to sell the tickets in any order. And people went there and saw the third one first and the first one second and got completely confused. They just didn't get it. And they also wouldn't let me do the tuning that you needed to do, because doing these attractions is like doing a Broadway show. You want to do a preview of it someplace and find out what's wrong and then iteratively modify it and take things out, recut, and kind of reproduce. And every good Broadway show has gone through this kind of preview process. They wouldn't allow us to do it. It became very frustrating at the end. But we built things like this gigantic theater, which was a vertical screen, 48 frame per second VistaVision movie I designed this theater to be later converted into an IMAX 3D theater, which they subsequently did. And it was really amazing to take a movie screen and tip it up on its end and make a really steep movie. It was really spectacular. And we built this giant motion-controlled camera crane that could traverse about 75 feet by 40 feet by 13 feet up and down with a camera on the end of it here and shoot all these miniatures. We created this amazing futuristic thing, and here's the gantry above and the extension. Mike Sorensen designed all this stuff for us. And this was just the most amazing motion control system ever built. And we were shooting with fisheye lenses, so we were able to use motion control to exactly match the photography and motion of the camera in miniatures to the photography and motion of the camera in full-scale sets, as well as computer graphics, and composite those all together at 48 frames a second and at 6K resolution on VistaVision film. And this was almost 20 years ago. So it was quite an experience to do that project, and it was very successful. We won some awards for it. And I even had to get into how to build hemispherical screens for our simulator rides and building the projectors. And here was an automatic screen painting machine that we had to build to make sure the surface of the screen was perfect, even though it was several gores of fiberglass put together. And one of the ideas that was intrinsic here which was totally revolutionary and is still not understood and has never been replicated, is the idea that if you're on this motion base, it moves left and right, forward and back and up and down, but it doesn't tip at all. All the tipping is done photographically, which means that each person gets exactly the same kinetic sensations. Flight simulators have a problem, and the Back to the Future ride had a problem, because if it tipped to the left, for instance, the person in the left seat's going down, but the person in the right seat's going up, and it's impossible to make a movie that satisfies both of those motions at the same time. So this was an orthogonal motion base, which I patented and became part of my ride film company that I merged with IMAX. And then we had this hemispherical screen, and this was pre-9/11, by the way. I wouldn't do this scene right now, but this is mayhem in the cockpit of an airplane, as an example. So you could photograph a full-scale set in the foreground, and these guys are duking it out in the cockpit while all kinds of mayhem, and they're going to crash into something outside the window, all composited into something. So in the ride for In Search of the Obelisk simulator ride, we had foreground action and background action. So there was dialogue, characters, conflict, interaction, story, plot, drama, happening in a simulation ride for the first time. And so we had to do all these computer designs and build little models of the theater, figure out all the sight lines, projection angles, designed and engineered this hydraulic motion base with, I think, 15 seats, figured out what the images would look like on this hemispherical screen. We had to design this projector. This is the theming that was on this kind of, we call this the weird, super futuristic Egyptian theming that we put on the motion base. And then at IMAX, we designed these automated projectors that could run for all day long, every day, automatically without a projectionist, that could be mounted overhead with fisheye lenses and completely automated rewind fisheye lenses like this. Beautiful, beautiful glass. So optically and photographically, this was a really stunning experience that was very close to reality. So here's some foreground action. So we had this kind of sled that was actually part of the vehicle that you're on board, and it has a driver, which is this guy, taking us on this adventure, and he gets attacked by this guy who comes down on a line, and they have a fight right in front of you while the vehicle is out of control. So we had all this kind of amazing Indiana Jones kind of action. We had sets like this where we got this foreground piece. It's all being composited with blue screen. Miniatures back here, a full-scale set here with other actors, all being composited at 6K resolution at 48 frames a second. It was really quite amazing and very, very successful. So you've got full-scale actors in a miniature set and a full-scale foreground and total dynamic motion going on in 6 axes of motion. And some scenes where the environment was completely computer-generated with a lot of shaders and rendering. And a very happy bunch of customers. And then a control room. We had to watch every ride with infrared cameras for security reasons. If anybody undid their seatbelt or got up out of their seat, alarms would go off and the thing would stop. It had to be watched constantly, so there are big, cutout switches here. So that's part of this crazy world of simulation rides. Now I'm going to talk a little bit more about what's going on recently and heading toward the present day in movies. And one of the geniuses at work in the whole world of computer graphics and alternate worlds is a guy named Paul Debevec at the Institute for Creative Technologies in Marina del Rey, California. And he has this thing called the Institute for Creative Technology, and he's doing some amazing work. And I want to show you something that I lifted off of his website. It's not my work, but it's an example of a direction that's going on that has led to the ability of Jim Cameron to do Avatar. And you'll see this, and then after this I'm going to show you a little Avatar stuff to show you how this all links together. So one of the projects that I started working on about 10 years ago was what I call virtual sets and locations, which is the idea that originally sprang from this Magicam thing I was developing at Paramount that they turned down. But I really believe that with blue screen and green screen and this coming process of infrared matting, you can superimpose anything into any environment with full camera mobility in real time. And I'll show you one little demo that a producer made with us at my studio called Monkey King. And it's using bunraku puppetry technique, so the puppet is about 2 feet tall. He's being shot with a zero-gravity boom, which is a camera I've designed and built and patented, that the cameraman can just grab the camera and move it around and aim the camera at the same time, but it's weightless and almost massless. So the camera can just float around anywhere on the stage and shoot a composite in real time. So every component of the camera has sensors on it, which are called shaft encoders, that tell the computer where the camera is at that frame, sends that information to the computer, then the computer generates the background environment for that position and puts it in the viewfinder and composites it in real time. So you see you see your special effect instantaneously while you're shooting. That becomes a reference composite, and then you go back in post-production and you fully render the CGI, because you can't really get photorealistic rendering in real time, but you can get pretty close. So I'm just going to show you this quick little demo of how we were doing this at my studio. Now, since we're running out of time, I'm going to jump past something I showed last night, which is a documentary about the making of 2001, which we did a lot of work on, and it was based on this whole idea of being able to composite people into worlds, and we were going to composite ourselves into 2001. But it's not going to happen. It got canceled by Warner Brothers for some weird reason, so I'm not going to show you this project. I am working on developing some feature films that'll use this technology now. I'm getting back to writing, directing, and producing and developing science fiction movie content that I think will work for this whole new world of virtual sets and environments. And so there's this movie production I'm developing right now. These are some illustrations by Robert McCall. And for example, one of the scenes in the movie takes place inside this capsule. There's kind of a little capsule that's orbiting around this spacecraft to create artificial gravity. So it's a little set that might look something like that. Here's a drawing of what it might look like. These actors are playing this orbit game, which is three-dimensional marbles. And I just wanted to experiment myself in my own workshop of how hard it really would be to build these sets as miniatures rather than as computer graphics. So I started building a miniature set in my shop. This is just some plywood and PVC tubing. It took about a week to build this set with me and my son. And so we painted it, and we started messing around with it. We detailed it out. We brought it into a place where we can shoot. And we lit it because the key light is now going to be rotating 360 degrees around the set, as it will be around the live actors, who are going to be shot separately. So it's going to be a virtual set composite in real time using a computer graphic miniature, a computer graphic set, and we're going to replace the computer graphic set with a miniature, but matching the motion using the techniques that we've used historically for motion control. And I think it's going to give a much higher degree of realism, and it's not going to look synthetic as a lot of computer graphics does, and it's going to be a lot less expensive. So this was a little test we did of that miniature with a rotating light and a rotating background. And so we started experimenting with 3D. We actually built a three-dimensional high-definition stereopticon with two high-definition monitors and mirrors, so you can look through these mirrors and see these monitors without any artifacts of polarization or any other 3D lenticular systems or anything like that. So we could see perfect 3D and really start experimenting with this whole world and superimposing people into that set, seeing it in 3D. And we've been making a lot of progress on this. And then another component is a patent I have on the zero-gravity boom, which is this thing with the camera out here. And this is the boom that we used in those shots that I showed you before. So the next phase is we're going to build a much larger version of this, can reach anywhere on a very large stage. This is a video camera. These are the shaft encoders here that sense the position of the camera in 3D space. Now we're working on an entry-level version of this, which will enable film students and colleges to do this kind of thing very inexpensively. And I'm working with a guy named Scott Lismondi at Hollywood General Machining and building a zero-gravity boom out of a portajib components. And this is under construction in LA right now, and we're just about to test it right after Christmas. And it's a really cool thing. This whole little gizmo, I can't use the word gizmo, device is going to cost about $5,000 instead of the original one that cost $250,000. So I've also been experimenting with digital single lens reflex cameras, which are quite amazing. If you've ever shot with a Nikon or a Canon, I'm using the Canon 7D with some Zacuto attachments. It's a very inexpensive camera. It's shooting full high definition 1K by 2K 24 frame movies very inexpensively. And I'm having good results with it. And my next step is I'm going to tear this camera apart and pull the chip out and build it into a new camera that will be able to be two chips side by side for a integrated 3D camera. Now, in the world right now, the red camera is the hot camera. It's not the only camera, but it's a good kind of mid-level priced camera. And I think we can start adapting this for 3D production as well, because the 3D cameras we're seeing these days are really cumbersome, awkward, and heavy, like the IMAX cameras have been and like the Cinerama cameras were. So we're in an early phase of 3D where shooting in 3D is a real pain in the neck, but it's going to get much better. But right now, I went to NAB just a few months ago in Las Vegas and saw all the latest 3D camera rigs. And I got to tell you, it's horrible because these cameras are clumsy, noisy, fat, heavy, obtrusive, hard to align. They create all kinds of horrendous post-production problems to composite 3D live action. And we're in our infancy of trying to solve a lot of these technical problems to try to make a whole new generation of 3D cameras and solve these problems so that shooting in 3D is not such a pain in the neck. I've been recently working with Terry Malick on Tree of Life. He won't let me talk about it. I think it's going to come out pretty soon. There's one shot I'll show you, just a little hint. There's me. There's a Phantom camera shooting at 1,000 frames a second in a vat of water. You can imagine how much paint or milk or whatever might have been in there. And we're designing one version of that film, which is called Voyage of Time, which is going to be in IMAX theaters in about a year after that, which is going to be this spectacular space experience, probably the closest thing to 2001 since then. And so we've been studying IMAX theaters, geometry, screens, projection. And this whole digital virtual studio I'm working on, which I want to do with my next film, is to build a stage that's designed with the zero-gravity boom, and everything is designed around that technology to automate the lighting grid so that we can do rehearsals on this and pre-light scenes and come back into our stage and reshoot. I'm even, hypothetically designing what a studio might look like if you did a whole bunch of these stages. There's a lot of advantages of the zero-gravity crane, digital cameras, automated lighting, very limited sets, a very smaller stage, a smaller crew, faster shooting, increased production value, and lower costs. So there's a lot of benefits to working this way because I'm going to actually design and reverse engineer screenplays that are purpose-written for this technology. And we're going to storyboard and pre-visualize in the same way that Pixar pre-visualizes all their movies with animatics and storyboards and temporary recordings of voices. And they go through this process 6, 8, 10 times when they're making a film to debug their movie before they shoot, before they actually commit to rendered animation. And that's why Pixar is batting 1,000 and making no failure movies at all, because they debug their movies. Now, if we can take that work process and apply it to live action on a set and shoot our movie over and over, re-edit the movie, change characters, change timing, change blocking, change camera angles, change the script, then when we actually shoot, we can shoot very, very quickly. It'll be a complete paradigm shift in the production of live action movies because you can shoot the whole feature film in a week or two. So I'm working on this whole idea. I'm writing screenplays for this technology, and we hope to kind of clone this and make it happen all over the world. We have to get funding. I'm not going to go through this. It's more like a business presentation. It's okay if you call me a mad scientist. We're about a half hour over. It's been fun showing you all this stuff. Jesse's going to have to tell me what we have for schedule availability for Q&A, which I'd be happy to do as long as you want.
Well, why don't we at least start the Q&A in here, and then maybe we'll move out into the lobby.
Okay.
In a little bit. There we go. That was awesome.
Thank you.
Very much a glimpse into the future of cinema and perhaps of scientific discovery as well. Let's open it up for questions while we've got the time. Yes, sir, right in front. Wait for the microphone.
Thank you. Frames per second is very interesting. I wonder if you can talk about how fast can we go, the technical limitations, the physical limitations of perceiving at that rate, things like that.
That's a very good question, and that's an area that I'm trying to explore right now, and I'm collaborating with several companies, both camera companies, because I've been recently shooting with Terry Malick at up to 1,000 frames a second. The Showscan experiment was shot at 120 frames per second, and we haven't figured out how to project it at 120 frames. It's something we're working on right now, and I hope to have it up and running in a demo facility right after Christmas. Nobody knows what the physiological effect will be or what the visual effect will be or how that relates to 3D perception. But I have applied for a couple of patents on some frame rate relationships between that and 3D to try to create ultra 3D that'll be like a real experience. It'll be taking off where Showscan left off. And I'm also working on a technology that would be hemispherical screens rather than just flat screens. So they're kind of wraparound screens, extremely high brightness, high reflectance, high gain, to try to overcome the dimness of 3D right now because digital projectors are kind of dim. But the 4K chips are coming out right now as we speak from TI to all the digital projector manufacturers. So we're going to just be doing some experiments. I really want to find out where this is going because it's not that I want to talk about Avatar forever, but Avatar created an alternate world, of kind of a virtual reality world that would benefit from high frame rates. It would not be diminished by having a super real environment to it that would be beyond television in that kind of texture. So I think, Jim Cameron wants to shoot his next film at 48, 60, or 72. He's been very open about it. He's been very gracious in talking about Showscan and remembering it as the best film process he ever saw. So I think we're going to start seeing some upward mobility and a lot of industry experimentation with frame rates in the near future.
Yes. Yes, you with the hand up with the glasses. Sure, might as well.
All right, hello. I'm very pleased to be here today, and I thank you very much for this wonderful show.
Thank you.
You're one of my childhood heroes, so I'm very grateful to be here. But all you showed us is old stuff now. When are you starting to work on holographic TV?
I have not seen any holographic system that I find credible, feasible, or operational. But if you think about holography of itself, what is holography? A 3D image, which is if you had a situation where you have an audience looking at a holographic movie, for instance, every audience member is seeing that movie from a different angle. That creates a whole disturbing paradigm shift in sight lines, angles of view, cinematic language, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, even if you could make it work. So you enter into this other world, which is more like real-time, unedited live performance, I think would be more appropriate to a holographic thing. So I don't know where that's going, but I haven't seen any credible large screen, color, high frame rate holographic systems. It just seems to be taking forever.
But you've seen some.
I've seen holograms, yes.
Okay.
They're not there yet.
Thanks. Hi, that was a really fascinating presentation. Thanks a lot. I'm happy to be here as well. But I wanted to ask about these stages that are going to be set up for these virtual green screen things that you're working on. You mentioned that you're writing screenplays and that we're going to be seeing a lot more of these in the future. And what I'm wondering about is how that's going to affect the nature of storytelling, and if you could kind of talk about what sort of angles you take when you're writing a screenplay for that sort of thing.
I don't think it'll fundamentally change storytelling if you're doing this virtual set thing for what you would call a feature film or a television show. I think that the cinematic language as it is will hold pretty true. And so you write pretty much the same, but as you start implementing these more immersive technologies where the screens get larger, wider, and the image becomes much more realistic and involving, you start heading into this territory that's like 2001, which was a first-person experience, almost like a virtual reality game experience, than a edited, dramatically performed classic movie style, with actors and over the shoulders and singles and close-ups and all that kind of stuff, which is fine for a lot of movies. But if you're going into this new territory, I think we need to start exploring the language of cinema and how you tell a different kind of story in a different way. And you get into really hairy problems of compatibility. If you made some monster movie like 2001 and you had giant screens like IMAX or whatever, how does it work when it's no longer in 3D and it's no longer on a giant screen and it's on your TV set at home? And what sacrifices do you have to make it compatible to both those mediums? There's a lot of business issues that go on in this that I've tried to kind of touch on with this whole history of Cinerama, what went wrong, what went well, business problems with it, distribution problems with it, technology problems with it, because we're facing all these right now with 3D. Exactly the same story is being told again. is how do we reevaluate our language? How do we make a different kind of a movie? What does it really mean to shoot in 3D? Is it just a gimmick? Does it have legs? Is it going to stay around? Are people going to get eye strain? I don't know. I can't answer those questions. I just know that for me, I really like exploring the extreme future of what immersive imagery can be to human beings. And if you want me to talk about retinal displays and the whole thing that I think it's going to be, we're going to make images that go into your brain and bypass. You're not going to have a screen anymore if I have anything to do with it.
I can't wait for that. Sir, yes.
No, thanks. Doug, I'm sure you're aware that the scan rate of the eye brain is in the 60 to 70 range. So I think that probably going beyond that doesn't mean much other than slow motion. But my question is, are you involved in the development of the IMAX 3D, which uses phantom cameras, not red?
That is the what camera?
Phantom.
I talk with those guys regularly. I am aware of the Phantom Camera 3D IMAX project. I'm trying to answer all the aspects of your question because I disagree that 60 or so many frames is the ultimate and that the brain can't accept any more. I'm playing around right now. I have a new Sony LED TV with a 240 hertz Motion Flow Pro. So it's actually got a processor inside the television set that's interpolating frames and taking 24 and turning them into 240. If it has sharp information to start with, it can actually do the interpolation and the image starts looking extremely vivid. Now, I don't know where the sweet spot is going to be between 24, 60, or 240 or whatever, because I want to get back to more of this elaborate testing, because I think you have to get beyond whose opinion it is. You have to actually test things like we did before. I'm the only person I've ever talked to, I talked to myself, that I know of who's ever done a laboratory experiment showing movies at different frame rates to see how people react to frame rates as the only variable, using electrocardiogram, electroencephalogram, galvanic skin response, electromyogram. Now we could do that very easily, but we could also do real-time functional magnetic resonance imaging or PET scans to map visual cortex stimulation with frame rates as one of the questions you're asking yourself. So frame rate stimulation is directly related to how fast something's moving across the screen. The faster it's moving, the more frames you need to keep it clear. Right. I haven't seen that yet. The BBC's been doing some high frame rate shooting. I just found a Sony SXRD lab projector at Sony that runs 240 frames. And we're talking with them because getting the pipeline of high resolution, say either 2K or 4K imagery out of a phantom camera at that high frame rate and all the way to a projector requires a whole bunch of SDI ports and fiber optics and other stuff to carry that kind of bandwidth. So I don't know what's realistic there or not. That's what we're experimenting with.
Last question, up at the back there.
Hi, I have a question about a specific film and about the direction of this technology, because I find it interesting that you keep using the word cinematic language and how we need to adjust cinematic language, and you've mentioned Avatar a lot. And Avatar is a film which is doing a lot of things technically, but at the same time, its cinematic language is pretty conservative. It's pretty much what one would expect from a Hollywood spectacle film. And the film I wanted to talk about, if you've seen, is the Wachowski's Speed Racer, which is also, I would say, a conventionally edited film for the most part, but has sequences where editing, as we understand it, disappears, and instead of cutting, we have a tapestry of imagery that is sort of sliding along, and there's new sort of compositing paradigms. And you talked about compositing a lot yesterday at the 2001 screening.
Right.
So I was just wondering where you think compositing is going, and how compositing could change cinematic language, because I found there were a lot of fascinating things going on in Speed Racer and in other films that are sort of not aiming for a realistic depiction of virtual space, but a really hyper real, really stylized. It's more partial to animation and different artistic sensibilities. So I just thought if you could speak about compositing, I'd be interested.
Well, first of all, I'm completely committed to digital compositing. I think it's absolutely fantastic. I'm really glad to never play with an optical printer again, because using Nuke or any kind of digital compositing software is really fantastic and makes us able to merge any image with any other image seamlessly and just about perfectly. So I'm all for digital compositing, whether the composited elements are live action, computer graphics, or miniatures, or something else, or super high speed, like we're doing with Terry Malick of shooting liquids and tanks and stuff at 1,000 frames a second, and compositing that with other elements that may have been shot at 12 frames a second, and using Nuke to put them together. I don't know where to go with that. I just think that I'm basically frustrated with 24 frames a second. I just think it just doesn't cut it anymore. It was a limitation imposed a zillion years ago by acetate film running through sprocketed projectors and mechanical movements, and the limitations of shredding the film or not wanting to use too much of it because it's expensive. Those constraints are now gone, and I think we can store almost any image. Storage is really not a big cost. I mean, you can buy a terabyte of storage at Staples for $100. So don't be afraid of storage or bandwidth. So I think we're going to just see things starting to get more and more vivid and more real, which are also related to brightness, perceived brightness, which is directly related to perceived color saturation and contrast. It's not just frame rates, it's a whole bunch of things. It's field of view, contrast, brightness, color saturation, clarity, acuity, blurring, strobing, flickering, all kinds of things are going on simultaneously. So I don't know what the perfect answer is, but I sure love playing in that territory and try to figure out what I want to do next, because I want to break out of this mold. And this Showscan thing proved to me that we can shoot at, we shot this at 120 frames, and we could perfectly extract 60, 48, or 24 seamlessly that looked exactly like it had been shot that way. Because you can shoot with a 360 shutter and blend any number of frames together and create a new frame that's as though the shutter were open longer, as though we were shooting at a lower frame rate.
At this point, I just want to remind everyone that Mr. Trumbull will be back this evening at 8 p.m. to discuss Blade Runner and have a presentation on that film, and that as we speak, the new 70mm print of 2001: A Space Odyssey is showing in Cinema Number 1. It's there for a while, so please come and see it. It's really spectacular, as was this morning's presentation. Once again, thank you very much, Mr. Trumbull.
Thank you, Jesse. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks.